You ever just walk outside, minding your business, and realize someone's already made plans for your backyard? Without telling you? Yeah, that happened to me. I thought I was just cleaning my pool like every other Saturday, but apparently I was also hosting a birthday party I didn't know about. This whole thing spiraled fast, from confused texts to HOA threats to, well, you'll see. I'm still not sure if I went too far or just far enough, but I will say this: never underestimate how entitled people can get when they think you're too polite to push back. This one's from QA Stories. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my place? It was a Saturday morning in late spring, and I was doing my usual weekend routine, cleaning and maintaining my pool after a long work week. This pool is my sanctuary, the one place where I can relax after dealing with demanding clients all day. Working on other people's pools made me appreciate having my own little slice of paradise even more. I was skimming leaves off the surface, testing the chemical balance, just enjoying the peaceful morning, when I heard my neighbor Meredith calling my name from the fence line. Meredith's the only neighbor I trust. Always low drama, keeps an eye on things when you're out of town, that sort of person. But the expression on her face that morning wasn't her usual cheerful self, and that immediately put me on alert. "Nolan," she said, glancing around like she was afraid someone might overhear, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Marla's been telling everyone that your pool is going to host Braden's birthday party next Saturday." I actually stopped what I was doing and looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Seriously? Did I miss a conversation somewhere?" "That's weird," I said, trying to process what she'd just told me. I've never even had a conversation with Marla about my pool, let alone agreed to host anything. The confusion on my face must have been pretty obvious because Meredith just nodded sympathetically and said, "I figured you didn't know. I thought you should hear it from a friend before you heard it from someone else." After Meredith headed back inside, I found myself standing there in my backyard, pool skimmer still in hand, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. I barely knew Marla beyond the occasional wave when we happened to be getting our mail at the same time. We'd never had any kind of social conversation, certainly nothing that would lead to me offering my pool for a party. A few months back, I had installed some basic security cameras around my property. Nothing fancy, just peace of mind after some break-ins in the area that had everyone a little spooked. Little did I know those cameras would end up being the most important investment I'd ever made for my own protection. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. The footage they captured would later become the smoking gun that exposed everything. But at this point, I was just a guy with some basic security equipment who thought he was being cautious. The whole thing felt surreal, like someone had written me into a script without telling me my lines. I'm not antisocial or anything, but I value my privacy, and my pool area is kind of my sanctuary after dealing with demanding clients all day. Looking back, I should have known this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Later that afternoon, I was scrolling through our neighborhood's community group. You know, one of those local social media pages where people complain about barking dogs and ask if anyone heard that loud noise last night. That's when I saw it, and I actually had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. Someone had posted anonymously, "Can't wait for Braden's pool party at Nolan's place next Saturday. Such a generous neighbor." The post already had several likes and comments from other neighbors talking about how excited their young people were and asking what time to show up. I sat there staring at my phone screen thinking, what the actual hell is happening here? There were comments like, "My family can't wait," and finally someone who cares about community. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality where I'd apparently volunteered for something I had no memory of agreeing to. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a full-blown assumption that had somehow become neighborhood fact. That evening, just as I was settling in with dinner and trying to convince myself this was all some bizarre misunderstanding, my phone chimed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Community Event Pool Usage Request," and it was from the HOA. I opened it, expecting some generic notice about pool safety or something, but instead found a polite but formal message asking me to consider allowing my pool for a special community celebration to support Braden's birthday party. The email talked about fostering connections and supporting young people, signed by Marla Denton, HOA president. The way this email was written, it felt more like a notification than a request, like they'd already decided this was happening and were just giving me the courtesy of letting me know. There was no mention of compensation, insurance, liability coverage, or even basic details like how many people we were talking about or what my responsibilities would be. The whole tone suggested this was practically a done deal. Sitting there at my kitchen table, rereading that email for the 3rd time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this whole situation. The timing seemed off. Why would Marla be telling neighbors about a party at my pool before even getting my agreement? And why did that anonymous post sound like this was already a done deal? I looked out my back window at my peaceful pool area, thinking about all the time and money I'd invested in making it exactly the way I wanted it. I've never been the type to jump to conclusions or assume the worst about people, but the way this was unfolding felt manipulative in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. The sequence of events, community announcement, first official request second, felt backwards and calculated. As I sat there rereading that email, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really a request at all, and I was about to find out just how right I was. Sunday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, I was enjoying my coffee on the back patio when I heard the front gate latch click. Through the side yard, I could see Marla walking up my front path with the kind of confident stride that suggested she owned the place. She was dressed like she was heading to a business meeting, crisp white blouse, perfectly styled hair, carrying a small notebook that looked official. The woman had clearly prepared for this conversation like it was a corporate presentation. When I opened the front door, her smile was so bright it could have powered my pool lights for a week. "Good morning, Nolan," she said in that overly cheerful voice people use when they want something big. "I'm just stopping by to confirm the details for Braden's pool party this coming Saturday." She said it with such complete confidence, like we'd already had multiple planning conversations and this was just a final check-in. "Sorry, Marla," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly but clear, "but I think there's been some misunderstanding. I never agreed to host any party." I could see her perfect smile falter just slightly, like a crack in a mask, before snapping right back into place. "Oh," she said, with a little laugh that didn't sound genuine at all. "I thought you understood how important community involvement is in our neighborhood. Now hold on, when did we jump from birthday party to community involvement lecture?" I tried to explain that I got her email but hadn't responded yet because I needed to think about it. I wasn't trying to be difficult or cause problems, I just needed her to understand that hosting a party at my pool wasn't something I'd automatically agree to without discussion. But the way she was looking at me, like I was being unnecessarily complicated about something that should be obvious, was starting to make me uncomfortable. Marla's approach shifted then, and I have to admit, she was good at what she was doing. Like, scary good. "Oh, Nolan," she said with this sympathetic tone that made me feel like I'd just kicked a puppy. "I thought you understood how devastating this would be for poor Braden. He's already told all his friends about the pool party. You wouldn't want to disappoint him, would you?" The way she said it made me feel like I was somehow the bad guy for not immediately offering my pool to someone I'd maybe seen twice in 3 years. Then she went into this whole thing about community spirit and how, as HOA president, she really valued residents who showed they cared about bringing the neighborhood together. "I'm sure once you think about it," she said, "you'll realize how much this means to our community." I'm standing there in my doorway, still in my weekend clothes, trying to process how a simple conversation had turned into me being lectured about community values by someone who'd never spoken to me before last week. I tried to explain that my pool was private property and that I wasn't comfortable hosting an event I wasn't consulted about. "Look, Marla," I said, "I'm not trying to be difficult, but this feels like something that should have been discussed before announcements were made. There are liability issues, insurance questions, and honestly, I just need to think about whether I'm comfortable with this." I suggested they could use the community center pool instead, which seemed like a reasonable alternative to me. The community center had a perfectly good pool, proper insurance, and was designed for exactly this kind of event. But the way her face changed when I mentioned the community center told me everything I needed to know about how reasonable she was planning to be. She gave me this heavy sigh and put on what I can only describe as a wounded mother expression. "I really thought you were more neighborly than this, Nolan," she said, shaking her head like I'd personally disappointed her entire family. "I guess I'll have to tell Braden that some people just don't care about his happiness." The conversation took a darker turn when she started making what I can only call soft threats. "I hope you'll reconsider," she said, but her tone had changed completely from the cheerful neighbor act. The HOA board really notices which residents participate in community building. There are so many ways we can encourage better neighborhood cooperation. The smile on her face didn't match the coldness I was seeing in her eyes, and I realized this wasn't just a pushy neighbor asking for a favor anymore. She was using her official position to pressure me, and she was being very careful about how she phrased her threats so they sounded like suggestions. This was next level, calculated, and official in a way that made my skin crawl. When she finally left, she made sure to mention that she hoped I'd think carefully about what kind of neighbor I wanted to be known as. I watched her walk back to her house, and I knew this conversation was far from over. The way she moved, the confidence in her step, this woman had done this before. 3 hours later, my suspicions were confirmed when I got an email marked urgent from the HOA. The subject line read, "Emergency HOA meeting," and it was scheduled for Tuesday evening. The agenda item was listed as Community Cooperation and Shared Resource Discussion, which was obviously about my situation since we'd never had any meetings about shared resources before. The email was signed by Marla and 2 other board members I didn't know well, and it emphasized that all residents were strongly encouraged to attend. This had escalated from a birthday party request to an official HOA matter in the span of one conversation. Marla wasn't just a pushy neighbor. She was someone who knew how to use her position to get what she wanted, and she wasn't going to take no for an answer easily. This wasn't about community spirit or helping someone have a nice birthday. This was about power, and she'd just shown me exactly how willing she was to abuse her authority to get her way. Staring at that meeting notice, I realized this had stopped being about a simple birthday party, and I had no idea how far Marla was willing to take this. I spent Monday evening researching HOA bylaws and property rights like I was preparing for trial. I printed out relevant sections about private property and community events, preparing logical arguments about liability and precedent. Something about the way Marla had handled our conversation made me think this wasn't going to be a simple discussion. I felt like I was gearing up for battle, which seemed ridiculous for a conversation about a birthday party, but here we were. I even printed out copies of relevant statutes to hand out if needed, because I had this sinking feeling that facts weren't going to be the primary weapon in this fight. Looking back, I was probably overthinking it, but my gut told me to be prepared for anything. Tuesday night, I walked into the community center meeting room to find Marla sitting confidently at the head of the conference table, like she was chairing a corporate board meeting. There were 5 other board members present, and I noticed immediately that most of them seemed to defer to her whenever she spoke or even looked their way. About a dozen neighbors were scattered around the room, and the expressions on their faces ranged from curious to concerned to completely confused about why they were there. Marla had turned a simple disagreement between neighbors into an official proceeding, and she was making sure everyone understood who was in charge of this room. I took a seat toward the back, trying to stay calm and remember all the reasonable arguments I'd prepared. I had no idea I was about to witness the most sophisticated manipulation system I'd ever seen in action. Marla opened the meeting with what I have to admit was a polished presentation about fostering community connections and the importance of supporting our young people. She talked about how neighborhoods thrive when residents are willing to share resources and help each other out. And she made it sound like hosting community events was practically a civic duty. Then she got emotional, talking about how much Braden's birthday party meant to him and how excited all the neighborhood people were about swimming. She even had printed screenshots of neighbors expressing disappointment in my lack of cooperation, which felt like she'd been building a case against me before I even knew there was a case to build. The whole presentation was designed to make me look selfish and unreasonable, and I could see some of the neighbors nodding along with her points. But then I started noticing something that really disturbed me about how coordinated everything felt. Every single time Marla made a point, the exact same 3 board members would nod approvingly, like they'd rehearsed this whole performance. When she asked for community input, only certain people spoke up, and they all echoed her talking points perfectly, using almost identical language and phrases. One neighbor mentioned how important it was to support our community leaders, and another talked about how selfish behavior could hurt property values. Their responses were too smooth, too coordinated, too similar in tone to be organic reactions. This wasn't just one pushy neighbor trying to get her way. Marla had built a system where people either agreed with her or stayed quiet, and she was using that system to isolate and pressure anyone who didn't fall in line. I wasn't fighting one person. I was fighting a machine she'd constructed. The whole room felt orchestrated, like a performance where everyone knew their lines except me. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up calmly and pulled out my research. "I appreciate community spirit," I said, looking around the room. "But if protecting private property rights makes someone a bad neighbor, then maybe we need to redefine what community actually means." I went through the HOA bylaws point by point, showing that there was absolutely no rule requiring residents to share private amenities for community events. I talked about liability issues, insurance requirements, and the dangerous precedent of pressuring homeowners to give up their property rights. I could see the room dynamics starting to shift as I spoke. Some of the board members started looking uncomfortable, and a few neutral neighbors were nodding along with my points. Even more importantly, I noticed that Marla's confident expression was starting to crack around the edges. She hadn't expected me to come prepared with actual legal documentation. That's when Meredith surprised everyone by speaking up. "Nolan has every right to say no to this request," she said firmly, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone pressured like this over their private property." Her support seemed to give other people permission to be honest, and suddenly the room didn't feel as controlled as it had when the meeting started. Another neighbor mentioned that she'd felt pressured to volunteer for committees she didn't want to join, and someone else talked about getting citations for violations that seemed made up. It was like Meredith had opened a dam, and people were finally talking about things they'd been afraid to say before. I could see Marla's face getting tighter as she realized her carefully orchestrated meeting was slipping out of her control. The machine was breaking down right in front of her eyes. Marla tried to regain control by switching from legal arguments to pure emotion. "We're talking about a young person's birthday party, not a court case," she said, her voice taking on that wounded mother tone again. "Sometimes community means going beyond what's legally required. Sometimes it means caring more about people's happiness than protecting your stuff." For a moment, I almost felt like maybe I was being too rigid, too focused on rules instead of relationships. But then I remembered how this whole thing had started. Not with a request, but with announcements made behind my back and pressure applied through official channels. "I'm not against helping the community," I said, staying calm even though I was getting angry. "But this sets a dangerous precedent. What happens when every event planner decides my pool is community property? I'm willing to help find alternatives, but my property is not available." The room was finally seeing both sides of this issue, and Marla's control was slipping away. The meeting ended without any official resolution, but something important had shifted. Several neighbors approached me afterward to express support, and one whispered, someone needed to stand up to her. Another neighbor mentioned that she'd been afraid to refuse HOA's suggestions because she didn't want to be targeted for retaliation. As I walked to my car that night, I felt like I'd won an important battle by exposing that Marla's authority wasn't as absolute as she wanted people to believe. But the way she watched me leave, with this calculating expression that suggested she was already planning her next move, told me the war was just beginning. I'd just shown the neighborhood that the emperor had no clothes, but I also knew that emperors don't give up their thrones easily. Walking to my car that night, I felt like I'd won an important battle, but the war was just beginning. Wednesday morning, I was getting ready for work when I found a notice taped to my front door. Grass height violation, immediate correction required, signed by the HOA Compliance Committee. Thursday brought mailbox maintenance required for my practically brand new box. And Friday was improper garbage can placement for bins placed exactly like everyone else's. 3 citations in 3 days. Tall grass, a spotless mailbox, and garbage cans positioned like every other house on the street. It was laughably obvious retaliation, but I took photos of my yard and several others on the street because this felt like the beginning of something systematic, and I wanted documentation. This woman was trying to death by 1,000 paper cuts me into submission, and she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I mean, seriously? Did she really think I wouldn't notice that my grass was somehow the only violation on a street full of equally tall grass? The administrative harassment was just the beginning. Posts in the neighborhood community group started appearing that seemed designed to paint me as the villain without mentioning me by name. Some people value their stuff more than young people's happiness, and it's sad when adults can't put community before selfishness. The posts all used similar language and talking points, posted by accounts that rarely participated otherwise. It felt coordinated, like Marla had enlisted her supporters to create a narrative where I was the bad guy in this story. Some neighbors who didn't know the full situation were starting to believe it, based on the responses I was seeing. The strangest part was the surveillance. People I didn't recognize walking slowly past my house, always pausing to stare at my pool area through the fence. One person even took photos of my backyard, which was bold enough to make me genuinely uncomfortable. When I tried to approach them, they just hurried away without answering. You know, I've shared plenty of neighbor drama stories on QA Stories before, but this felt different. This wasn't just petty complaints or boundary disputes. This was organized and systematic in a way that actually scared me. It was like Marla had declared psychological warfare, and I was just starting to understand how many weapons she had in her arsenal. The level of coordination and planning was honestly impressive. if it wasn't so creepy. The pressure was getting to me more than I wanted to admit. Maybe I should just host the damn party and be done with it. Maybe I was making this into a bigger deal than it needed to be. I kept thinking that all of this could have been avoided if Marla had just asked me directly instead of assuming she could pressure me into compliance. But then I'd remember that confident stride up my front path, and I'd realize this was never about asking. This was always about taking. While reviewing camera footage one evening, I noticed something from the previous week that I'd missed before. Marla and Braden were clearly visible in my backyard, which was already a violation since they'd had to open my gate to get back there. They were pointing at the pool and having what looked like an animated conversation, with Braden gesturing excitedly and Marla nodding along. At the time, I'd dismissed it as innocent curiosity. Young people love pools, and maybe they'd just wandered back there by accident. But seeing it now, in the context of everything that had happened since, it felt less innocent and more like reconnaissance. I saved the footage anyway, just in case. Looking back, that decision to save the footage would turn out to be the smartest thing I did in this entire mess. I had no idea at the time that this clip would become the smoking gun that exposed everything. Saturday morning brought a new escalation that pushed me closer to my breaking point. I woke up to find a small, official-looking sign planted in the grass across from my house, reading, "Pool Area Under Safety Review, Neighborhood Watch." There were no city markings or permit numbers on it, so I photographed it and called City Hall. The city confirmed they had no record of any safety review for my property, and they sent someone out that afternoon to remove the unauthorized sign. The officer who removed it said, "Someone's playing games with fake official notices." We see this sometimes in HOA disputes, people trying to make their personal complaints look official. It's actually illegal to post fake government signage. That conversation made me realize that Marla wasn't just manipulative, she was potentially crossing legal lines to get what she wanted. Finally, a tiny win in this psychological warfare, but I knew she wasn't going to stop just because one of her tactics had backfired. Sunday evening brought the final provocation that made my decision for me. I came home to find an official HOA notice taped to my front door with the heading, "Mandatory Pool Inspection. Suspected drainage issues affecting community groundwater." According to the notice, the inspection had to be completed by the following Friday, and failure to comply would result in fines and potential legal action. The absurdity of it was almost funny. My pool system had been professionally installed just 6 months earlier, and there was no way it was affecting groundwater. But as I stood there reading that ridiculous notice, something clicked in my mind. They want me to drain the pool for inspection? Perfect. I'll drain it all right, but I'll do it exactly when they least expect it, and I'll do it so thoroughly and legally that they'll have no grounds to complain. Holding that bogus inspection notice, I realized Marla had just handed me the perfect weapon, and she had no idea what was coming. If the HOA was demanding pool drainage for an inspection, then I was going to give them the most thorough, documented, and legally bulletproof drainage in neighborhood history. I prepared everything according to code. Proper winterization procedures, safety protocols, and exactly what constituted compliance with HOA inspection requirements. This wasn't going to be an angry reaction. This was going to be malicious compliance at its finest. I was going to drain that pool the night before Braden's party and document every single step for potential legal protection. The beauty of it was that I'd be giving Marla exactly what she'd asked for, just not in the way she expected. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it so professionally and by the book that no one could accuse me of being vindictive or destructive. Tuesday, I gathered everything to make the scene look official. Professional caution tape, safety barrier posts, warning signs, and everything I'd need for a complete pool drainage setup. I compiled everything into a packet: emails, photos, timeline documentation, even a formal letter addressed to responding officers that explained the situation clearly and focused on my compliance with HOA requirements while protecting property rights. The key was making sure that everything I did was not only legal, but exemplary in terms of safety and professionalism. I even researched the specific language used in municipal pool maintenance notices so my signage would look official and appropriate. I felt like I was planning the most elaborate, perfectly legal gotcha moment in suburban history. Every step had to be documented. Every action had to be justified. Every decision had to be defensible if questioned. Wednesday, I finished organizing the timeline documentation showing the pattern of escalation and harassment, from Marla's initial assumption to the bogus inspection notice. The letter would be attached to my fence where any police officers would see it immediately if they were called to the scene. I wasn't taking any chances that Marla might try to spin this as vandalism or property destruction. Having worked on pools for years, I knew exactly how to empty it efficiently and safely, much faster than normal residential methods would allow. Friday night at 11 p.m., I began the drainage process using my professional equipment. I stayed awake all night monitoring the process, taking photos to document the careful, methodical way I was handling everything. By sunrise, the pool was empty, spotless, and barricaded like a city project. I wanted it to be obvious that this was professional maintenance work, not some angry act of destruction. Saturday morning at 6 a.m., I completed the final touches on what I can only describe as the most thorough pool safety setup in neighborhood history. I installed bright yellow caution tape around the entire perimeter, placed multiple professional-looking signs, and added clear notices about trespassing and unauthorized entry being reported to police. I attached my letter to responding officers to the fence where it couldn't be missed and stepped back to admire my handiwork. It looked like a legitimate municipal maintenance operation, which was exactly what I was going for. If someone was going to question this, they'd have to argue against their own official requirements. I'd given Marla exactly what she'd asked for, compliance with the HOA inspection requirement, just not in the way she'd expected. This wasn't about revenge, this was about boundaries and showing that you can't manipulate people into giving up their property rights. As I stood there in my backyard at 7 a.m., coffee in hand, surveying my completely empty, professionally secured pool, I felt a mixture of satisfaction, nervousness, and anticipation that was hard to describe. I felt like I'd just set up the most elaborate, perfectly legal response in suburban history. There were moments where I wondered if I was going too far, but then I remembered weeks of harassment, fake citations, and psychological pressure tactics. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, and if Marla wanted to play bureaucratic games, I was going to show her what real bureaucracy looked like. By 9 a.m., I could hear the party preparations beginning next door. Decorations being hung, music equipment being set up, and excited voices of people arriving for what they thought was going to be a pool party. I positioned myself in my kitchen where I could hear everything but not be seen, and waited for the inevitable discovery. I could hear Braden's excited voice talking about swimming and other people asking when they could jump in the pool. Marla's confident voice drifted over the fence, assuring everyone that they'd be swimming soon. She just needed to check on a few things first. The anticipation was almost unbearable. Any minute now, Marla would confidently lead a group of 18-year-olds to my backyard, expecting to find a pool ready for their party. There's something almost poetic about giving someone exactly what they asked for, just not how they expected it. Sitting there with my coffee, listening to the party preparations and laughter next door, I knew there was no turning back from what was about to happen. The pool that Marla had assumed would be available for her son's party was now a perfectly empty, professionally secured construction zone, and she was about to discover that assumption is the mother of all neighborhood disasters. Any second now, the most confident woman in our HOA was about to have her world turned completely upside down. At exactly 10:45 a.m., the sounds of party preparation next door came to a sudden, complete stop. The music cut off mid-song, and for about 10 seconds there was this eerie silence that felt like the calm before a nuclear explosion. Then I heard it. "What is this?" Marla's voice echoed across both yards with a volume and fury that probably woke up half the neighborhood. The sound of confused people started almost immediately after that. "Where's the water? And why is it empty? And what happened to the pool?" I could hear footsteps rushing around my backyard, and I knew Marla was seeing my handiwork for the first time. The professional caution tape, the official-looking signs, the completely empty pool that had been full of clear, inviting water just 12 hours earlier. I had to stop myself from laughing at the mental image of her face. The chaos that followed was both heartbreaking and satisfying in equal measure. Braden's voice, disappointed and confused, cut through all the other noise. "But you promised we could swim. You said there would be swimming." His disappointment was audible even from my kitchen, and I'll admit that hearing that young person's letdown did make me feel bad for a moment. But then I remembered that this whole situation existed because his mother had decided to use him as emotional ammunition to pressure me into giving up my property rights. The sound of confused adults trying to explain something they didn't understand themselves was almost worse than the disappointment. I could hear people asking each other, "How did this happen?" and trying to figure out what went wrong with their carefully planned day. The pounding on my front door started about 5 minutes later, and it was aggressive enough that I was genuinely concerned Marla might break something. "Nalan, open this door right now," she screamed, alternating between pounding and ringing the doorbell repeatedly. "You psychopath, you deliberately ruined my son's birthday. How could anyone be this cruel to people?" When I finally opened the door, I was completely calm and composed, which seemed to infuriate her even more. "Hi, Marla," I said in the most neutral tone I could manage. "Is there some kind of problem?" The look on her face was like someone had just told her that gravity had stopped working. Pure confusion mixed with rage. She clearly hadn't expected me to be this calm about the situation, and it was throwing off whatever script she'd prepared for this confrontation. "You drained your pool on purpose to destroy Braden's party," she screamed. "You're a sick, vindictive person who gets off on hurting people." I held up the official HOA notice she'd had delivered to my door just a week earlier. "I received an official HOA notice requiring immediate pool inspection," I said calmly. "I complied with all safety requirements and followed proper protocols for pool drainage." I showed her the exact notice with her signature on it. "Pool must be drained for inspection of potential drainage issues affecting community groundwater." Watching her face as she realized what I'd done was like watching someone solve a puzzle they really didn't want the answer to. She'd been outmaneuvered by her own fake bureaucracy, and the realization was hitting her like a freight train. The beauty of my response was that Marla couldn't argue against her own HOA documentation without admitting the inspection requirement was fake. She was caught between two impossible positions: either accept that I'd legitimately complied with HOA requirements, or admit that she'd fabricated the whole inspection to pressure me. "You know that's not what we meant," she finally screamed, which was as close to an admission as I was going to get. "I did exactly what the notice required," I replied, still maintaining my calm tone. "I even added extra safety measures to exceed compliance standards." The look of trapped fury on her face told me she understood exactly how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered by her own game. She'd handed me the weapon and I'd used it perfectly. After about 20 minutes of screaming at me with no success, Marla stormed off, threatening to have me arrested for malicious destruction of property and intentional infliction of emotional distress. 20 minutes after that, I watched 2 patrol cars pull up in front of my house. I have to admit, even though I'd prepared for this possibility, seeing those police cars still made my heart rate spike. Marla had clearly given them an emotional story about deliberate sabotage of a birthday party, because when Officer Johnson approached my door, his expression was initially skeptical. "Sir, we've received a complaint about deliberate property damage intended to disrupt a community event," he said. "The complaint alleges you intentionally drained your pool to prevent people from swimming." I invited him to examine all my documentation and explain the situation calmly and thoroughly. I provided all my documentation, the fake HOA inspection notice, photos of the professional drainage and safety setup, my timeline of harassment and escalating pressure tactics, and the letter I'd prepared explaining my actions. "This timing does seem very convenient, sir," he said initially. But as he studied the HOA notice and my safety compliance photos, his expression started to change. "I have every legal right to maintain my own property according to HOA requirements," I explained. "I also have every right to protect my property from unauthorized use." When he saw how thoroughly and professionally I'd handled the drainage, complete with proper safety barriers and official-looking signage, his skepticism shifted to something like impressed confusion. Meanwhile, Marla was putting on what I can only describe as an Academy Award-worthy performance for the other officer. Tears were streaming down her face as she talked about her traumatized son and how she'd trusted me as a neighbor and thought I was going to help make someone's birthday special. She kept repeating that all she wanted was for her son to have a happy birthday, and couldn't understand how anyone could be so cruel to young people. Even I almost felt sorry for her. She was that convincing in her role as the devastated mother. But then Officer Johnson asked her to explain the specific authority for the inspection requirement, and she got flustered trying to justify what was obviously a fabricated demand. Watching her try to explain the legal basis for her fake inspection was like watching someone try to explain why water flows uphill. The turning point came when Officer Johnson really studied that HOA inspection notice. "Ma'am," he said to Marla, "can you explain the authority under which this inspection was ordered? Because there's no city permit number, no reference to specific code violations, and no contact information for the inspecting authority." She kept saying things like, "Sometimes the HOA needs to address community concerns, and we have the authority to ensure neighborhood safety," but she couldn't provide any specific legal basis for the inspection requirement. Officer Johnson's expression went from skeptical to understanding as he realized what had actually happened here. "Sir," Officer Johnson finally said to me, "you have every right to drain your own pool for any reason, including compliance with what you believe to be legitimate HOA requirements." "Ma'am," he said to Marla, There's no law requiring property owners to host private events on their property, regardless of the circumstances. He actually complimented my safety precautions, saying they were exemplary and showed clear concern for public safety and proper procedure. The look on Marla's face as she realized the police weren't going to help her was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse in real time. She tried one last emotional appeal. What about basic human decency? What about caring about people? Officer Johnson's response was perfect. That's a personal matter, not a legal one. But filing false official notices could be a legal matter if we find evidence of that. Before the officers left, Johnson warned Marla about continued harassment and suggested she focus on alternative arrangements for future events rather than pressuring neighbors about their private property. As I watched those patrol cars drive away, I thought this nightmare was finally over. The police had essentially validated everything I'd done and made it clear that Marla had no legal grounds for any of her complaints. But as I looked back at Marla, standing in her driveway, still surrounded by the remnants of the failed party, the expression on her face told me she had one final card to play, and I wasn't going to like what it was. Monday morning brought a neighborhood-wide sympathy campaign that was more sophisticated than anything Marla had tried before. She claimed I'd entrapped them by appearing reasonable while secretly planning cruel humiliation, describing me as an adult who psychologically abuses people and the kind of person who destroys community trust. I have to admit, reading those posts made me question myself for the first time since this whole thing started. She was making me sound like someone I wouldn't want to live next to either. The worst part was that some of it almost sounded believable, even to me. Several neighbors who hadn't been involved started commenting with things like, "What kind of person does this to someone?" And I started receiving cold stares when I got my mail. One neighbor actually crossed the street to avoid walking past my house. For the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt genuinely isolated and started wondering if maybe I really was the bad guy in this situation. The shift from being the victim of harassment to being painted as the neighborhood villain was jarring and effective. The lowest point came Tuesday evening when I seriously considered making a public apology just to end the harassment and social isolation. I drafted several versions explaining my side, but acknowledging that maybe I'd gone too far, that maybe protecting my property rights wasn't worth hurting someone's feelings. I felt genuinely terrible about Braden's disappointment and started thinking that being technically right wasn't the same as being actually right. The psychological pressure was getting to me in a way that all of Marla's previous tactics hadn't, because this time it felt like the entire community was turning against me. I was starting to understand why people usually just give in to this kind of manipulation. Fighting it was exhausting and lonely. The irony wasn't lost on me that after standing up to official HOA pressure, I was being broken down by anonymous social media posts and dirty looks from neighbors I barely knew. That's when Meredith came over, with information that changed everything. "Nolan," she said, looking around nervously, "I've been hearing things about how this whole situation really started, and you need to know the truth about Marla's real plan." "Stop letting her control the story," Meredith said firmly. "You have evidence that she's not telling people about, and it's time to use it." She was talking about my security cameras, and she was right. I'd been so focused on defending my actions that I'd forgotten about the footage I'd captured weeks before any of this started. That woman has been planning this from day one. Meredith continued, "And other neighbors are starting to see through her victim act, but they need proof. And you're the only one who has it." I'd almost forgotten about that security footage I'd nearly deleted weeks earlier. The cameras had been recording everything, and I suddenly remembered the clip of Marla and Braden in my backyard from before any community request or HOA emails had been sent. I pulled up the footage on my computer, and what I found changed absolutely everything about this situation. The timestamp showed this was from 1 full week before any official requests, and the audio was crystal clear. What I saw and heard made me realize that everything about Marla's story was a complete fabrication. This wasn't a misunderstanding or even aggressive negotiation tactics. This was premeditated fraud from the very beginning. The smoking gun was a conversation between Marla and Braden that had been captured with perfect clarity by my security system. Braden's voice was excited and innocent. "Mommy, this pool is so much nicer than ours. Can I have my party here?" That part was exactly what you'd expect from someone who saw a cool pool and wanted to swim in it. But Marla's response was what changed everything. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Mommy knows how to make things happen." When Braden said, "But it's not our pool," Marla's reply was chilling in its calculation. Sometimes adults have to be creative to get what people deserve. "This pool will be perfect for your special day." She wasn't responding to her son's innocent request. She was already planning how to manipulate the situation. The tone in her voice was cold, calculating, and completely premeditated. She'd been planning to take what she wanted from the moment she saw my pool, using her son's desire as justification for theft. The footage proved that every email, every meeting, every pressure tactic had been part of an elaborate scheme that started with trespassing and evolved into systematic harassment when I didn't comply with her demands. I spent the next day carefully documenting everything: the video footage, the timeline of events, and the pattern of escalation that followed my refusal to hand over my property. I posted a calm, factual response in the neighborhood community group with the video evidence and a clear timeline showing how this had really developed. My statement was simple. I believe the community deserves to know the complete truth about this situation, including evidence that shows this was planned before any official requests were made. I let the footage speak for itself, because the truth was more damning than anything I could have said. The audio was clear, the timeline was undeniable, and the premeditation was obvious. Within hours, the narrative began to shift as people realized they'd been manipulated into attacking the wrong person. The community response was immediate and dramatic. Neighbors who had been supporting Marla felt betrayed and deceived when they realized how she'd manipulated them. Comments shifted overnight from, "How could you hurt someone?" to, "I can't believe I signed that petition without knowing this," and "She played us all for fools." Several people who had defended her publicly sent me private messages apologizing for believing her story without getting all the facts. The psychological pressure that had been building against me evaporated as people realized they'd been used as weapons in Marla's manipulation campaign. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in real time. People were actually angry at themselves for being fooled, and that anger transferred directly to Marla. One neighbor commented, "I feel sick that I defended someone who planned this whole thing while standing illegally in someone else's backyard." Another wrote, "My family was asking why adults lie about other adults, and I didn't know what to tell them." The revelation that Marla had trespassed and then built an entire campaign around stealing my property hit the community harder than I'd expected. Some people started sharing their own stories about feeling pressured by Marla, but being afraid to speak up. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for Friday evening, specifically excluding Marla from the proceedings. The vote to remove her as president was unanimous, and they immediately canceled all her bogus inspection requirements and opened an investigation into other complaints that had been filed under her leadership. 2 other residents came forward with stories about being pressured and threatened over various property issues, and the pattern of abuse became impossible to ignore. The new acting president issued a formal apology to me and implemented new policies requiring written consent and proper insurance for any community event requests. Within 2 weeks, a "for sale" sign appeared on Marla's lawn. 6 months later, our neighborhood feels healthier and more honest than it has in years. The new HOA president focuses on transparency and actual community building, rather than manipulation and control. Neighbors communicate more directly with each other instead of going through official channels for every little thing. People actually ask before assuming now, which seems like a revolutionary concept after everything we went through. The whole experience taught everyone that good intentions don't justify boundary violations, and that community spirit can't be forced through guilt and pressure. I even hosted a small, genuine community gathering at my pool with proper planning, insurance, and everyone's enthusiastic consent. It felt good to use my pool for its intended purpose, bringing people together instead of being a weapon in someone's power game. Meredith was right when she said I hadn't just protected my property, I'd protected everyone's rights. And according to Meredith, Braden ended up having his make-up birthday party at the community center, where he seemed genuinely happy and made lots of new friends. Sometimes, young people are more resilient than the adults who manipulate them. The real tragedy wasn't a ruined birthday party. It was a mother who taught her son that manipulation and theft were acceptable ways to get what you want. Looking back, I don't regret draining that pool for even 1 second. Not because I enjoyed the drama, but because some battles are worth fighting. This was never about a pool party or even about Marla. It was about the principle that respect has to be earned, not demanded, and that you can't force community spirit through manipulation and guilt. Marla thought she could use her position, her son's disappointment, and social pressure to take what wasn't hers. She forgot that sometimes the quiet person who just wants to be left alone is the most dangerous person to underestimate. The security cameras I installed to protect my property ended up protecting something much more valuable: my right to say no, and everyone else's right to make their own decisions without being bullied into compliance. The note I had prepared for the police, I never needed it. The truth, captured in high definition, was all the protection I required. Sometimes the best way to deal with a manipulator is to let them reveal who they really are, while you simply stand your ground and document everything. The moral of this story is simple. Always ask before assuming, respect other people's boundaries, communicate honestly instead of manipulating emotionally, and if you're going to trespass and scheme in someone's backyard, maybe check for security cameras first. Trust me on that last one, and that's how draining a pool turned into draining the HOA president's power trip. I didn't plan for things to explode like that, but I also wasn't about to let someone guilt trip me into giving up my backyard. Funny how one little security camera ended up flipping the whole story. Honestly, I still wonder if Braden's doing okay. I mean, the young man just wanted to swim. But maybe now he'll grow up learning that asking first goes a long way. Got your own petty revenge story or an HOA nightmare you're still mad about? Drop it in the comments. I read everything, and if stories like this keep you hooked, don't forget to subscribe to QA Stories. You won't want to miss what's coming next.
From the whispers to the wreckage, QA Stories brings it all. Click that next video, if you can handle it.